Welcome to another episode of Industrial Strength Podcast, a podcast more focused on the industrial fire departments and industrial responses. My name is Jeff, a hazmat technician with 20 years of experience in the fire service, with 10 being in the industrial side. With me today are once again my co-hosts, Randy and Steve.
Hey, I'm Steve, a hazmat technician with 3 years of experience on industrial response team and 10 years of industrial experience overall.
Awesome. My name is Randy. Currently a hazmat specialist. I got 17 years on our industrial fire department, with all 17 of those doing hazmat.
Woo woo!
Yeah, I know.
What are we doing today?
We are talking about rail cars. So we, in one of our previous episodes, we're always soliciting feedback from listeners, and one of the things that one of our listeners asked about was to talk about rail car incidents. So they were interested in maybe what to do in a rail car incident and maybe what some of our incidents were that we've had to deal with. So that's what we're talking about today, fellas. What do you think about it?
I think we should go for it.
Alrighty. So we'll start off by talking about some of the common types of hazardous materials that are transported by rail. Those include flammable liquids, toxic gases, corrosive substances, explosives, and radioactive materials.
Right.
Jeff, would you like to touch base a little more on each of those?
Yeah, with flammable liquids, you have your crude oil, ethanol, gasoline, ticking time bombs going down the rail. You have your toxic gases. We use on our site methylene chloride quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But they also do chlorine, which we get those in 1-ton cylinders.
Right. So, we don't typically get that as a commodity by rail, but we certainly could, right, if we definitely needed a higher quantity. And a lot of places do that.
Yep. And then anhydrous ammonia, again, we get that shipped in by truck, but you still have large quantities of that going through the rail. Mm-hmm. And then there's corrosive substances, sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, really a lot of polymers even. That's not necessarily corrosive, but there's a lot of polymers that go through rail as well. I guess ammunition and fireworks, that might be fun.
I wish we got some of that on site.
Yeah.
And then, there is radioactive materials, especially from the nuke sites or the nuclear power plants. I'm not sure what else necessarily comes from there.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I mean, for us, for our purposes, really, the majority of what we get, because we do get commodity by rail. So, and a lot of companies, some don't, right, just because they don't consume enough, but we definitely consume a high volume of certain chemicals. Like we get flammable liquids, solvents for sure by rail, and we also get a lot of corrosives by rail as well, not only acids but bases. And so we have a high volume, and one of those things that for us is always a bit of a balancing act, because we always try to maintain only a certain number of rail cars on site at any given time. Because I know at one point in time, just like with any other commodity, when it's hard to get your hands on things, people like to stock up, right? If you remember the beginning of COVID, toilet paper was insanely difficult to get, right? So anytime you hear the hint that something might be running low in quantity, you always stock up. And so there's one point in time we had, I think it was like 120 or 150 rail cars on site, and it was a concern because a lot of it was flammable. And I think the crazy stat that I had heard, and I always repeat, is that the energy stored in a rail car of flammable solvent, if it were to go off, is like the equivalent of like a Tomahawk missile. Which,
oh gosh.
Right, pretty serious, especially if you have an incident. So staying on top of it, of those rail cars, and knowing how to handle them is key, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to get at in this episode, right? Is how to handle your business safely so that your team can be effective and you can keep whatever your site is running. And so it's also one of those things where, like, for us in an industrial side of things, we're an endpoint user, right? We're typically not catching things in transportation like a municipal department would. We are definitely the endpoint user, so things are dropped off to us almost UPS style, and then it's our job to deal with it as it sits on our rails.
I'll say,
Absolutely.
so that does bring up a little bit of a uniqueness that we kind of have too, because even though outside rail companies drop those cars off to us, we then have our own internal locomotive department and operator for the site itself. So once it makes it inside our gates, it's all on us to move those around.
Right, yeah, which is definitely a different kind of thing. I have to say, one of the things I'm glad about is that the last couple of years we have really gone hard a little bit in railcar training. Talking about the engine we have on site, about the anatomy of a railcar, how to move them, safety features. And so that's something we focused hard on the last 3 years or so.
Sure,
so
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm glad we've done that because it's just it was very eye-opening. I'll put it like that. A lot of things we didn't know, and that I'm glad we didn't have an issue before that. But now I think we're in a much better place and more apt to respond readily and knowledgeably about whatever may happen. So,
Absolutely.
But listen, Jeff, we deal, once again, we deal with a lot of rail cars, flammables, corrosives, but what are some risk factors associated with the rail car incidents?
Well, just like with any vehicle, but you have mechanical failures, you have even a tank car design. The DOT 111 train cars, the tank cars, and really those had I think they still do, the ones that are out there, had very high rates of leakage and very poor crash worthiness, I guess, if you will.
Okay.
But then there's the human error, miscommunications between the engineers and the operators, improper handling, and then there's always that lack of training.
No.
And then there's always the environmental factors, especially with what's going on in California, the forest fires.
Yeah.
There's extreme weather, poor track conditions, floods.
Yeah.
It's, going back to some of the mechanical failures, though, you're looking at bearings. We'll talk about those in a little bit. The brakes and couplings failures lead it to the derailments too. So,
yeah. I'm thinking, for me, I think that for us, of all the, and we don't have, I'm not saying we have like volumes of rail car incidents on site, right? We have a handful, and all of them really go back to mechanical failures of the rail car itself, or actually the rail line, because we've had two derailments. Both of them came back to mechanical failures of the rail line, which is interesting. So it's not always the rail car that leads to a failure. Sometimes it's the rail lines it's on that lead to a failure.
Yep.
So
that and those environmental factors too, from a human perspective, we've had a couple injuries just due to those exterior weather constraints. Kind of like the weather we got outside right now, -4 and windy, icy. It's very easy to slip while you're working on one of those. Right,
and if I remember right, it led to our conductor of our rail car, or our engine. He wound up getting a broken hip. There was a number of winters ago, hopped off the rail car, hit a patch of ice, landed, broke his hip. So, environmental factors are definitely a thing, not only for moving a rail car, but the safety of the workers on it, and especially the responders too. I agree with you 100%.
So, Steve, what safety measures are out there for these rail cars besides, you can't help the slipping?
Right. So we've got some monitoring systems. You touched base, Jeff, on the bearings and stuff like that with mechanical failures. We actually have monitoring systems that detects the hot bearings and wayside monitoring systems to identify those issues early on so that they can be prevented from being a catastrophe. Also, we touch base on those DOT 111s being outdated and a little unsafe. Those have now been upgraded to a DOT 117, which has better crash protection and safety features all around on it. We also try and put in place regulations and standards. Those are such things like regular inspections, improved car designs, and then emergency protocols being put in place ahead of time so that we have plans for reaction. And kind of going right along with that, also emergency planning. for those situations, which can also include collaboration between our local responders, for our instance on site, and outside municipal departments, and then the rail operators as well from both outside companies and then our internal transportation department for tailored responses to those scenarios.
Right, and I want to touch on that for a second. So one of the things we did this last year is we contacted CN Railroad, right? So, and they have a safety team, and this was phenomenal collaboration between them and our industrial department. They came on out with their safety team, and they gave us a day-long safety class on railcar safety and the features of a lot of the rail cars, how to handle it. Basically any valves on it, pressure relief devices, and it was a phenomenal class, right? So it was also one of the things that was really nice because it was a free class. So we didn't have to spend out of pocket, because we talked a couple episodes ago about mercury meters that, once again, were held to a budget, right? And so a lot of times cash can be tight, but a free class put on by a major rail carrier, CN, and they're willing to come to your site and help teach you. Oh, that was a phenomenal class. So
it was a lot of useful information. Yeah,
it was. And not only was it a collaboration with them, but we also invited our municipal department to come view with us. So we kind of got that same training.
Right. Yeah. So they're aware of what we're dealing with, what we have, how we're handling it, and they're just lockstep with us. So it was a great double collaboration. So industrial and municipal, along with the rail line, it was really, really nice.
Yeah, absolutely was.
Yeah.
Yep. So would you guys like to kind of touch base on what our responses to railcar incidents might be?
Sure. Once again, everything is safety first, right? So we want to make sure that we're safe, the site's safe. So once again, it's like the three things. So life safety, make sure everyone is alive, as healthy as they can be, and away from the spill or whatever else is going on, derailment, whatever it might be. So life safety, scene stabilization, environmental protection, right? So we're always looking at those three things. So we want to ensure safety first. So we want to make sure that we evacuate anyone from the local area, especially if it's a leak, a derailment, a fire, something, spicy. We want to get people who aren't evacuated sheltered in place, right? Because we're trying to always limit the number of looky-loos and walk-arounds we have. We've talked about that in previous episodes.
Never have any of those.
Never, but we always try and limit it, right? So shelters in places. And then we want to try and secure a perimeter, right? Try and cordon off an action area, a hot zone as you would, and then a warm zone, so exclusion perimeter. And then we always want to make sure that we're checking what the contents of the rail car are, right? And there should be placards on the exterior of the rail car. If no one's done this, sometimes it's a fun little game. You see a rail car or a semi truck go by and it's got a placard. Everyone should have an ERG. It's cheap, easy. You can get one on your phone. It's a simple app, but grab that 4-digit code, look up what the commodity is in the rail car, right? Because that ERG is a phenomenal thing to tell you what your initial evacuation zone is, isolation zone. It also can give you tips on what PPE you should be having. But like we said on previous shows, we also use other systems to determine PPE. But so that's also one of the things we want to make sure that we've determined what is the correct PPE for our people so that they stay safe while responding to this incident. So that's step number one.
Yeah, and then there's always the notify authorities. There's a National Response National Response Center and the rail operations. The choo-choo train should have all of the paperwork for what they're carrying. The conductor should have all that stuff.
Yeah, it's like an onboard manifest. Although I can't remember, like they got a special name for the train, but it doesn't matter. You're right. They should have a cargo manifest.
Yep.
And just to point out for all those out there that don't know how to get a hold of National Response Center or the rail operators, at every intersection there should be a sign posted at those rail crossings with a phone number that includes the actual rail crossing number, not the street crossing, because you could be contacting somebody from a completely different country and they're not going to know those street names. So always make sure you're identifying that place properly.
Right. And that might be a little difficult. Steve, yeah. Might be a little difficult, like with somewhere like our site. We have a lot of rail line that isn't governed by roadway names. We have informal names for it, but there's no way in hell. So on the other end of the phone.
Oh my gosh, no.
Yeah, it's the backside of our blankety blank. They all have no idea where it is.
And those street names change every 2 years anyway, so.
They can.
If that long.
Right. But so if you can identify an intersection, great, but sometimes that identification is just not there.
And in those situations, if anyone else out there has sites like ours, I think that's mostly going to come on the internal and municipal departments, and then contacting the railroad after the fact, probably.
Yeah. So once you contact the railroad or whatever you're going to do, let's assess the situation, evaluate the leak size, weather conditions, any risk to the population, infrastructure. Let's figure out what we have going on first. I mean, if it's on an industrial site, you should probably know what it is and probably have some kind of a plan in place already.
Yeah, agreed. So, I think one of the toughest things for an industrial site sometimes may be like when we're talking about like a regular hazmat scene, where let's say we're talking about a misbehaving drum, a 55-gallon drum. It's easy to get around it. And let's say even if we have to transfer from one drum to another drum, it's easy to get those drums side by side and handle it, or even manhandle a drum and move it into an area that's more convenient for you. If we're talking about a rail car issue, those things can kind of go out the window because there's no way you're going to get, like, let's say it's a leaking rail car and you want to do a transfer or something or a capture. I mean, you're talking thousands of gallons. So if you want to transfer from one rail car, how are you going to get a empty rail car to your scene quick enough to be able to do that, right?
Yep.
And so this is kind of where like the pre-planning and thought go into it, because if you're not going to do rail car to rail car transfer, I mean, maybe you're thinking semi, or maybe you can be lucky enough and offload it quickly with some sort of containment underneath the leak that'll handle it. But it's something you got to wrap your head around, because once again, we're talking a grotesquely large volume as compared to most other hazmat incidents.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Oh.
So again, with that, contain and mitigate. Can you seal the leak? Can you seal the valve? Deploy containment tools. We've talked about our patches that we've used or that we've purchased. I don't think we've necessarily really used them yet.
Yeah. Yeah, because that goes all the way back to that acid leak episode. So you're talking that MagnaSeal, which would be a phenomenal thing for this kind of call, like a hole in the sidewall or something.
Yeah.
And there are some great videos out there for this specific type of call on those MagnaSeal patches.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree, like that would be a great way to do that, plug and patch easy. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, continuing, there's protecting the environment, block the storm drains and waterways.
Yeah.
We don't want any of that to get into our waterways.
Right. I mean, you have to do the best you can, because if you think about like the elevated rail lines, that there isn't really a ton of drain there or sewer line that you could block off. So we're talking environmental remediation or capture, maybe by using plastic sheeting or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And with any massive leak, though, you're going to have to call in other agencies to help clean that up.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I know once again on our site, we're very reportable. We're very accountable for what we have, what we do, what we release intentionally or unintentionally. So for us, it's a lot of reporting that has to be done, especially if we're not moving quickly and we let a lot go.
Sure.
So.
And on the flip side of that, you're talking about the environmental side of things, getting other agencies in. We also have that unique factor that's nice, that we have an environmental team on standby, a contract company that we can have come in and help clean up and mitigate anything that might have spilled outside of containment.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some recent developments in the rail car safety? What do you think, Steve? What have they come up with? We kind of touched on it a little bit.
So they've came out with some stricter standards on the designs of these tank cars out there, obviously switching from the DOT 111s to 117s. and kind of expedited the phase outs of those older models. They've also kind of started enhancing hazmat training. Like we talked about, a lot of teams have started having more routine trainings on the rail cars. And then larger agencies have been putting on more detailed trainings for that, for rural responders especially. And then also there's just technology, certain things that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago, like drones and sensors for remote monitoring of the hazards and assessment.
Yeah, that's a big change. That's for sure.
Yeah, there's actually monitors on the rail lines to monitor the, I think, the bearing temperatures. It was briefly explained to me, and I don't remember how far they're spaced apart, but it monitors every time that car goes by, and they can compare it to each monitor down the road. So,
oh, that's nice.
Kind of interesting.
Point-to-point comparison. That's really nice.
And I think there's been a couple major cases in the past probably 10 to 15 years that have kind of led to these improvements. Do you happen to know what those ones might be?
Well, there was one up in Canada back in 2013. I can't even pronounce the name of the city. I'm not even going to attempt to. That was a crude oil derailment, and that led to an explosion and a lot of fatalities, I believe. But then there's the most notable one, I think back in 2023, the East Palestine, Ohio one. And that was due to an overheated bearing, and that released hazardous materials of all sorts.
Yeah, that was a bad scene all the way around because there's a lot of contamination and no fault of the initial responders, right? But the size of that issue outstripped the local resources immediately. And it wound up being bad.
And from my opinion, we could do a whole separate episode just on that call alone and what the outcomes could have been, what the key impacts were. I'll leave that up to you guys. You think maybe we should do it that way, or you guys want to touch base real quick on that one?
I think we could almost do another episode just on the hazards of of the East Palestine.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we should do maybe we'll do a special episode, like a deep in depth dive on that, because what they had going on, the hazards they had, and how they dealt with it is definitely unique. It's a unique fix for a unique situation, and they were forced more or less to do it.
Yes, and it was a very controversial decision, but it did take a lot of pre-planning and thought going into it, which most people don't recognize from the outside.
All right, so we'll put a bookmark in that. We'll circle back around. So if our listeners find a deep dive episode on East Palestine, they'll know where it came out of this episode.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we could touch on that in just a few minutes. There was so much going on there.
Yeah,
and if I would have had that call and I would have seen what that sky, I would have been like, "Yep, I'm going the other way."
Yeah, agreed. I mean, like I said, it was a bad setup, wound up being bad. They're not quite done with all the remediation. It required a lot. Unfortunately, or unfortunately, right? The rail line was the one at fault because it was their faulty equipment, and so they wound up having to pay a lot out of pocket in order to make it right, to do the environmental remediation, to replace all the damaged fire equipment and gear, to buy houses that were contaminated beyond what was considered safe. There's a lot of money.
There's a lot of money. I don't think it's even done yet. I'm not quite sure.
No. But let's once again, we'll skip that. Maybe we'll come back to it as a deep dive episode because, like I said, there's a lot that can be talked about. But I want to go back and focus maybe more about when we do talk about failures of a rail car that happen or we have, like factors that might influence cleanup duration, right? So because we've had some leaks on site and typically they come from bottom valves. But when we're talking about that kind of thing, the factors influencing a cleanup duration, just like with any other hazmat, I want to touch base on the fact that it depends on what you're cleaning up from, right? So each different chemical has a different thing that it likes and it doesn't like. right? So something that it plays well with and something that it reacts very negatively towards. Sometimes that thing is just moisture in the air. Sometimes it's a heat source or a different chemical. But the type of hazardous material that's contained in that rail car will kind of determine what kind of cleanup you need to do, what kind of PPE your guys need to be in. Obviously, volatile chemicals are a much more acute hazard where they can reach out and touch you and hurt you right away real quickly. And I'm thinking about things that could polymerize quickly, which is also part of what the issue was in East Palestine. So, but other things are persistent chemicals, right? So it could be heavy metals, right? So it might require a deep environmental cleanup. So sometimes these cleanups, if you don't get to the leak quickly, it could be long plays.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, as far as cleanup goes, though, like you said, a small leak, maybe days, hours.
Yeah.
But you have maybe even one tank car that's even half emptied because of a leak. That could be days, weeks, even months. Yeah. You have a full tank car. I mean, you could talk maybe even a year or two.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And one of those things that kind of plays into that length and amount spilled is kind of the location of where it happens. If you're in a remote area up in the mountains or way out in rural BFE, it could be the whole rail car by the time somebody makes it there.
Right.
As supposed to being right downtown in an urban area, it might be a more condensed spill, but it'd probably be a smaller, more minor spill.
Right. So I think it would be an important thing for people to have to think about pre-planning gear that they're going to need. Right. So if we're talking like containment of leak under a rail car, I mean, like a containment pool and a way of pumping that out to other containers or even a semi might be helpful. For us on our site, we have some chlorine C kits, which is for rail car, right? And we have those and we train with those because if you have a leaking vent valve on the top of the car, that's going to be really your key tool to fix that thing.
Absolutely.
So to seal it up and seal it off. But I think, and also like we talked about the Magna Seal. So having some preset tools on hand to be able to correct an issue is going to be the difference between containing an issue and losing half a rail car before you find a fix.
Oh, sure.
So I
and
think
then what kind of risk are you going
takeaways.
to put yourself into trying to remediate this?
Right.
I mean, if it's some nasty stuff,
right.
And
one of the other things many people might not know is I know this from our side of things is if you do have a leaking rail car, like a leaking bottom valve, and that valve has not been fixed, they will not let that rail car move. It has to be tagged out of service and it has to be stationary at a location until that valve is fixed.
Correct.
So, or it has to be emptied, tagged, cleaned, and then it can go directly to a repair yard, and that's it. So it's a very stringent set of rules for that kind of thing. And we've had that a couple times too.
Yep. I mean, you just touched base on some of those approvals that have to be done by outside agencies such as the EPA before you can even do the cleanup, and it's going to add time to it. But I think we may want to touch base a little more on kind of a rough timeline of how cleanups might go on that. So what do you think you might see in that first couple hours to full day?
I would think that obviously initial evacuations around the rail car would be the first thing you'd see. And then you'd see efforts on trying to contain things, right? So damming, diking, pools to capture leaks, diverting, And then I would think emergency mitigation, especially if this is something that is, once again, a more acute kind of hazard. And I think you would see those kind of efforts within the first 24 hours or to try and limit the release, leak, and effect on the general population around that rail car.
Sure, absolutely.
But then in the next couple of days to weeks, I think you're going to start seeing, if it can be cleaned up because it's a simple thing, you'll see those cleanups. But if not, if once again it's like a bigger leak or something nastier or environmental hazard, I think you're going to, in those days to weeks, you're going to start seeing the initial short-term cleanup, right? So you're going to start seeing the rail car cleaned up, moved, gone, but then you're going to start seeing environmental monitoring, sampling, topsoil removal, things like that, to try and get rid of the hazard that was leaked into the environment.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think,
and even like with polymers, though, that
Yeah.
stuff, I believe that gets hard after a while. And I mean, that's going to be a mess to clean up. I can't even imagine that.
Yeah. And then if it's seeped into the soil, it makes it even harder.
Right. Yeah.
But once again, some of those more pervasive chemicals, or if it's been leaking for a while, it might take weeks to months to eventually clean it up entirely. Just once again, think about like East Palestine, how long it's taken to really clean them up, and I don't think they're back to 100% yet either.
Not that I've heard of, anyway.
No. But okay, that's been a trip, man. All right, how about we put a pin in it here for rail cars? What do you guys think about that?
I'm good with that.
Okay. Absolutely.
But I mean, there's a lot to dive into here, and
like I said, don't be surprised for our listeners if you see another episode specifically about East Palestine, because there's a lot to wrap your head around with that rail line incident. But what I do want to hear is, if anyone else has to deal with rail cars, if you have rail line service to your site, or you're a municipal department and you have to deal with rail cars on the regular, let us know what you've had to deal with. Let us know how it works out. Maybe some gear that you use, like we talked about, stuff we have that you find is useful in rail car incidents. That would be great. And then, Steve, how do they reach out and find us?
For any thoughts or comments you have, you can reach out to us at hazmatharder@gmail.com. And just to touch past what Randy spoke of, I'd like to also hear of what kind of trainings you guys might do out there, maybe scenario-based, hands-on, that could give all of us out there better ideas for preparation of railcar responses.
Absolutely.
Great. But Steve, I heard you might have an inkling of what we're going to do next episode.
Oh, do share. Yes.
I can't see. What's that red cloud?
I love it.
That ominous vapor red dense cloud that falls to the ground. We'll be talking about one of the chemicals that we use in various forms on our site.
Yeah. Gotta be bromine.
Yep.
You gave it away.
Wonderful. All right, man. Well, then tune in next episode to listen about bromine, the ins and outs.
Have a great night.
Thanks,
Until
everybody.
next time, Hazmat Harder.
Hazmat Harder.